All right, well, welcome back, everybody. I think most people were here on Tuesday. If not, very briefly, I'm Daniele. I work at Canonical, where I'm a director of engineering. And this is the second of this pair of workshops. This one is not about the framework itself, but it's about an approach to documentation that I've developed that aims at making documentation more pleasant and enjoyable for you to do when you're actually doing it. And I mean, literally less painful, because I know people often talk about it as though it were something painful, and it shouldn't be. So same kind of house rules as before. Please ask questions at any time. You can raise a hand, you can answer each other's questions and so on. That's really valuable to do, so please do that. We'll have, I'll do a bit of talking, it's inevitable, but I also want to have as much discussion and work on the exercises as possible, and especially, above all, to hear about how you think this is going to apply to your own work. And it's a workshop, so phones and so on, distractions off, because it's great if you can interact. So the two workshops correspond with some of the work that I'm doing at Canonical on our documentation strategy. So 4 pillars of that strategy. The first one we actually covered in Tuesday's workshop. It's our direction, the standards of documentation quality. What makes documentation good, and how do we make it good? And the other pillar is the pillar of execution, how we actually do our work. And that's what I want to talk about today. So, quick reminder, this is the map. It's not the map of documentation, it's the map of user needs when they're being served by documentation, practitioners of a craft, and it kind of gives us hints about how the documentation should be, but it is above all not 4 boxes into which you must stuff your documentation. It's 4 different kinds of needs that documentation must serve. And so it's a map of the territory. And we have a compass to use with the map. So like a truth table, kind of. If something's practical and it serves study, it must be a tutorial. And that's actually the tool that we use. So you've got the compass and the map. You should, if you don't, well, you can actually get them from the slides, but I'll be talking about them anyway. I now want to get on with that first exercise, part 2, exercise 1. So I hope this is clear for you to see. What we have here is some fictional software documentation. Is the text large enough for you to see? Good. Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So it's the content of the documentation is okay, but the structure is very poor. And what we're going to do now together is improve it. And we're not going to touch any of the inline content, but we're just going to move sections around and maybe change some headings. Okay. So it's a fictional example of some kind of turtle graphics program. So we've got various bits in it. It goes into various things. And we should, well, let's start here. Okay. So I want to make a decision to improve this. But first I need to know what it is and what it's trying to do. So I need you to help me, and I need you to tell me what it is that I'm looking at. What kind of stuff am I looking at? Or what kind of thing is this text here trying to be?
So this section here's the tutorial, right? It's the basic turtle drawing section. I moved that whole bit right up to the top and relabeled it as tutorial. So having a paragraph.
Okay. Why do you say it's? I mean, maybe it kind of looks and smells like a tutorial, which is a good enough answer, but can we use the compass? Can you say really explicitly why it's a tutorial?
I think, I mean, if you scroll a little bit further up, there's a section which starts with, you have to skip that instantly wired turtle bit. I moved that out. I think there's a section, launch it by double clicking the turtles application item, or by typing turtle in the terminal window. So I took that bit, removed the incidentally bit, and then stuck in the a few straight lines section.
I agree with you, Simon, but you're still jumping ahead a little bit, and you're saying what you did, whereas I want to analyze the thinking behind it. So what? Okay, you mentioned this part specifically.
So there's a practicality to it, right? Like you are actually doing things, and you're taking actions. Okay. But they are specific actions that are meant to sort of give you experience, right? Which is part of why it's falling into tutorials.
Exactly. Drawing a few lines and things isn't really completing a goal or a task like a how-to would.
Okay. All right.
And the very first sentence says an intuitive understanding of the basic paradigm, which is like feeling comfortable in the kitchen rather than let's make a drawing.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with you. So right now, what's the smallest concrete thing the smallest one, not the biggest one, not the end goal, but the smallest first step that I can do right now that would be an improvement?
Change the title for basic turtle drawing to basic turtle tutorial or something like that.
Something like tutorial basic turtle drawing, would that do?
I'll allow it.
Okay, good. All right. Okay. All right. So I'm hanging around in here, and we agreed that this was tutorial-like. What about this? Simon, you had some comments about that, I think. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that bit there it's explanatory information. I moved that to the very end and put a separate header on it, I think.
Let's also, again, I agree that it is explanatory material, but
I actually moved it above turtle geometry in the opening paragraph.
Okay, right. From now on, you're absolutely forbidden to tell me any more about what you did, okay? No more. I want to know what this is. Okay, is this practical or theoretical?
Theoretical.
And is it going to serve someone's study or someone's work? Is it for acquisition?
Study.
It is. Okay, so that makes it
Explanation.
Okay.
Or explanation. Yeah.
So what is now the simplest, smallest thing that I can do that will make an improvement?
Move it out of the tutorial.
Okay, I'm gonna. Thank you. Perfect. I'm moving it. I'm gonna put it there. That's all. That's already better. The tutorial is now no longer there's no sudden step in there. Okay. Do we like that? I mean, have a look at the level of headings here down the left-hand side. Do we like that, or is there something else we could do that would just again make us feel a little bit better about the state of this world here?
Raise the heading.
That could be one thing. I mean, I think that
maybe create a new heading and move that underneath it.
Like, do you mean something like that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think so. Okay, and I feel cleaner now how I've done this. Yeah. Okay, so what else did we have? So we've got kind of a bit of an explanation and tutorial forming. What is this? Oh, there's something else here. There's something. Well, this is using the geometries model, and that seems to be inside an introduction to turtles. Well, okay. I mean, let's pick up this section since it's the one we found here. Does this seem to you to be something practical or something theoretical?
I'd say practical.
Oh. And does it look like it would serve my study or my work when I want to get something done?
work.
And why do you say work rather than study?
It's giving you specifics of how to accomplish a specific thing. So you would kind of come to this being like, I want to use this model. What do I do with it? And then it's going to help you achieve that goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of hints, if you look at options that you have at your fingertips. So it says import the geometry class you want to use. It's not telling you which geometry class you're interested in. You know, you might get completely different results with one geometry class or another. It's just saying, you know, I'm expecting you to be able to make that decision. You're the adult here, so you go ahead and make that decision. So I agree that it's a how-to. Oh, sorry, Florian, I just saw your hand up. I don't know if it was up for a long time.
It was for a bit, but that was the plan because it was maybe a little bit of a digression. I was wondering that explanation we just moved out, and let me just close my window because there's some traffic outside here. I'm not sure if you can hear. I was wondering, I was told, at least for things like books or such, which might not quite be the same medium, that you shouldn't have a heading with only one item in it. So like as a gut feeling for me, it would make sense to have these explanation categories if we had more background explanations. But here I was wondering, in a book at least, that would maybe be some kind of info box, which at least visually sets it apart from the tutorial and tells you could skip this if you're not interested in it.
That's actually a fair point. So let's just, yeah, so why not, let's just, if that's troubling you, let's just do that. Okay, so it's not called explanation, and you're saying that maybe it seems weird to have a heading called explanation when we've only got one thing that's we're being explained, but it is explanation. Why a turtle anyway? So we'll leave it like that. Does it make you feel better, Florian?
It does, I think, yes.
Okay, good.
I mean, it's not that I feel bad about it. It's just something I was wondering about.
Our emotions are very important, even in software. So we were looking at this, okay? And I think we all agreed it was a how-to guide. Who can suggest the tiniest thing that we can do to improve this?
Add
Add a
new-
new.
The note, I thought was several different things mixed together. So one of the things I did was go through the note kind of word by word, coloring each word according to whether I thought it was practical or theoretical. And then I ended up dividing that into different places in the document.
You actually removed this note here.
I cut the note apart. Some pieces of those belong with the rest of the explanation. Some belong in other places.
Okay. Well, we could do that. That's quite a lot of steps.
Yes.
And I wonder if right now, we can still do that if you like, but right now, is there one thing that I can do in all of this that would be an improvement?
In that case, my
Paul-
suggestion is take the note out.
You could take.
I thought we weren't supposed to touch I thought part of the instructions was we weren't supposed to touch the text.
Well, you can move sections of the text around. Yes, that's fine.
Oh,
Yeah,
like
I mean-
like sub headings, because
Yeah.
see, normally I would have done quite a few things there, but I wasn't sure exactly how tight that constraint was. But
I mean, I've seen, I think from Anderson, to rename this to, rather than using the geometries model, I think it's how to use the geometries model. I think that's a big improvement already. I don't like titles that are, you know, installing such and such, using such and such, because it could just be, oh, it's me talking about using it or me talking about installing it. This is how to use it. So that's an improvement. Now, it's true that this sentence here, to go back to, I'm sorry, I don't know who was making that point actually, about some things being jumbled up in there, but it's true that that sentence is a sentence of explanation. But, you know, we have to be pretty reasonable about this. It's a pretty common pattern that in a how-to guide, you know, it'll give you a list of steps and say, warning, the handle may be hot, or note, this replaces the old, you know, you might be familiar with the old thing. This is what replaces the old thing. It's not going into explanation. It's just a word of explanation. And I think that's okay the way it's in a note, you know, and this is how to in the steps below. You can use the same classes and methods, but just use a, you know, import them from a different module. So to be honest, I'd be inclined to leave that there, because at the moment when I'm using the geometries module, it's quite likely that I've come from using the old Lobachevsky module, and this would be a useful piece of information for me to have at my fingertips at that moment. So I would prefer to leave it there, but we can always come back to this later. Someone has their hand up. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Hi.
Darshita. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I had a quick question on this. To me, it felt like there was a lot of preamble before we actually lead the user to the actual steps around how to use the module. So the way I was thinking about it is we would leave this note in, but just move this note maybe towards the end of the how to guide, so that we are still able to impart this information. But you know, we are not starting with a lot of information that they might already be familiar with, because in the last session we also talked about how to is for a user who is, you know, already competent.
Sure. Okay. I mean, what we might do is, you know, here we're saying to import the geometry class from the geometries module. So I think that this note probably should come before that. Otherwise, somebody's going to be caught out because maybe they were used to importing the wrong thing. So I don't think it wants to be too far away. It's so I think as a little warning about something to be aware of, this blade is sharp, this thing is hot. I think that place is not bad for it. Someone else had their hand up now. Okay. All right. So do you know what bugs me? That we've got all this stuff here and the tutorial seems to be at the end. That doesn't feel quite right to me. So we could, well, I shouldn't be me suggesting.
You certainly move your geometry section past the tutorial.
Okay, well, why not? Yeah, that makes sense. You know that you do.
Well, and the geometry section should also not be underneath the indents are almost done. So the indents need to all be fixed in terms of the heading levels. So the geometry level, the how-to section should be either its own top level section or under a top level how-to section. And then the tutorial should.
Yeah, like that. So it's the same level as tutorial. Yeah. I'm sorry. Again, I wasn't quite sure who was speaking there. Was that Barry or was that someone else?
That was Ken.
Okay, Barry.
Yeah. So I had a question. I mean, so the discussion we just had kind of made me think about a question, which is, you know, when I think about how I might practically write this documentation, it's probably going to live in one single set of docs, right? Like it might be a bunch of pages in repo documentation, a bunch of RST files or MD files, or it might be a single Google Doc like you have it here. And I'm just wondering if the framework sort of gives recommendations about how to present these 4 different quadrants, how to order them in a way that takes the reader on a journey, on the right journey.
Okay, that's an interesting question. And I like to do it in the way they're presented clockwise. And I think that kind of follows the user's interaction in the, you know, their cycle of interaction. We start with the tutorial, then we think about doing something real. Once we think, okay, I understand this now, let me try it for real. And then we want to look something up in the reference to check it. And then we get tired and we take a break and we think back, we reflect on it, and that's where we need the explanation. And then we go around the cycle again, except it's never really quite, it's not really like that. Nobody goes round and round in that circle. That's idealized. We jump around in real life from one section to another. You never know what somebody's entry point is going to be, for example. But I do think that there is a kind of logic to that way round. And so
Right.
I do like to reflect that logic, but I don't think that actually people are going to be going round, in a neat, orderly, clockwise way. That's just not going to happen.
Right. Do you think it's dependent on the familiarity someone has? I think we've talked about this sort of idea about the familiarity that someone has with the topic, right? Clearly, if it's like something I know really well and I just need to look something up, I'm going to go straight to the reference and I'm just going to look up an API or something like that, right? Or but if it's like something totally new, like one of the things that really bothers me is like people, a lot of times people will make an announcement, hey, I just released a new version of package XYZ, and they never really actually tell you what package XYZ is or does, right? So you're like, okay, kind of like, why should I care about this? And so like one of the things I think is really helpful is to sort of have that introduction up front, like here's what this thing is.
Oh yeah,
this
of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's not that every single thing in your document, every single chunk of text in your documentation must fall under one of these. You take any book, whatever the chapters are, it's still going to have a contents page. It's still going to have a preface, a forward, an introduction, a back cover with a little blurb on it. So there's all this kind of other material. And so it will be with your documentation. These are not 4 boxes into which everything must go, but there will be all kinds of supporting material, like you say, a little introduction about what this damn thing is. Yeah, I'm kind of conscious of the time. Darshita, very briefly, go on.
Yeah, so I had a follow-up question. So if we have multiple projects that we want to cover, so basically we have multiple tutorials. The first one is covering super simple implementation of our project. So basically it's for creating your first project, something like that. But then you want to have tutorials for, covering different aspects, again, leading the entire journey. So what is your recommendation around where it should be placed?
Okay. I would call that one tutorial in different sections, and the whole tutorial should be a journey from that first step, installation, your first interactions with it, creating a project, joining 2 projects together, whatever it is. And it should be as carefully planned as a medical education syllabus. Okay, it goes on a journey of learning, each step building on the one before. And that should be called the tutorial, even if it's in lots of sections.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's move on. So anyway, we've done some stuff here, and I can't quite remember where we were, but okay, here's another piece to look at. Turtle class methods and attributes. Where does that start? Oh, that's this section here. Yeah, okay, turtle class methods and attributes, and it kind of goes down to there. Theoretical or practical?
Theoretical.
Theoretical.
For work or for study?
Work.
For work.
What does it make
For
it?
study.
For study. Why is it for study?
Wait, did I mess it up? Because I know it's a reference. And going to my truth table here, I can see that a reference has, it's just such a common pattern that it follows that pattern just instantly clicks. But it's theoretical knowledge.
Yep,
and it's specifically for doing tasks. So it is. Sorry, it is for work. I messed up. Like, wait a minute, it's definitely not for study. You wouldn't read this on, on the plane. You would read this when you're doing something. So
exactly.
I mean, if you're a nerd like me, maybe.
So it's reference. Great. What's the one thing that we can do to make this better?
Add the word reference.
Type the word
Sure,
reference.
yeah, I mean, like that. That's maybe adjust the heading, of course. Does it look right to you that it's before the tutorial?
No,
I put it
No,
toward the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to the bottom.
I mean, my at least my view, at least when we kind of did the SQLite, when Erlen and me and Azio, I think, helped, is that the reference should be fair. We put the reference after the tutorial and before the how-to, and then before the explanation, because we wanted the reader to have the tutorial and then be able to jump right into the reference, or jump right to the reference. Of course, with the headings, they can just navigate to it, but our view is that the how-tos are more specific, whereas the reference is more, it kind of covers the whole module, versus the how-tos are for specific tasks. So you would, but I feel like there's definitely room for doing things differently there.
Yeah, I mean, I would much rather have it there, and I think the fact that it's specific is a better reason for putting it sooner. Actually,
let me just say that. Can you hear me good?
Yes.
Yeah, you're a little quiet, but yeah.
I'll try to speak louder. So one of the reasons we kind of ordered, or one of my reasons for ordering the SQLite docs like we did, was that that's how most of the Python standard library is ordered. It's many of the modules starts with a kind of a tutorial, and it goes straight into a reference. And also, all of these standard library docs are placed in the reference section of Python docs, so it makes sense to put them quite early. So that was one of my main reasons.
There are no.
I also think it works well.
There are no rules of, there are no laws about this. For me, I like the pattern that matches this kind of idea of the idealized circular flow, but it doesn't matter too much. You're going to find the links anyway. I do want to hurry along a little bit. So I'm just, what else have we got here? Oh, this is still the tutorial. Oh, here's something else. Turtle geometry. Theoretical or practical? Let's be very quick now. Theoretical or practical?
Theoretical.
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 Is it for work or for study?
Study.
Makes it
explanation.
Okay, so
we do have two under the explanation category.
We do have two. Yes, we do. Yeah, but that's okay. We could. It doesn't. It takes us 2 seconds to change a heading, and and it doesn't matter that we redid the work, because was it Florian? We made Florian feel better for about 5 minutes, and this is about pain, about feeling better. So that was a good thing to do. It was an intermediate step. Great. Now we've got introduction. Yeah, we've got a tutorial, how to reference. Let's just go back to the tutorial. Now this, you could say, well, that's got some explanation and so on, but I think it's normal. You get a book off your shelf, whatever book it is, and it's funny enough, this is a maths book. You go into it's got a preface and stuff like that. So why not have an introduction at the front of our documentation telling people what it's about? Yeah. So I don't feel that I have to put this into anything else. Does that feel okay to you, or does it make anybody itch?
It's okay.
Yeah. I like having an introduction there. What I didn't like too much is having just in the second paragraph, we have like the commands that are going to be used. That is like too much for the second paragraph, in my opinion.
And it's meant to give you a little flavor and an idea, and maybe the experienced programmer will say, oh, that's really cool, or I don't know. You'll just have to make your own aesthetic judgments, your own educational judgments. I can't give you a law, but that seems okay to me. Whereas that other stuff about different geometries and so on was too much. Yeah. So let's just have a quick check. So we've got an introduction. We go into a tutorial. A few straight lines. Control the pen. Some shapes. Yeah, great. Some how-to guides. Some reference, and then 2 things. And for me, I think we've got into a good shape. doing that.
Just some housekeeping. We do need to outdent the two. The attribution method should be, if we're going to have a top level reference section, then attribution method should be kind of top, L3, H3 headings. I guess on a more practical note, my view, and I would like to hear briefly your opinion on this, is that we should try to keep section titles to as short as practical and not repeat information, unless it's like clearly directing the user to the section. So it's just easier to navigate. So instead of saying introduction to turtles, when it's right underneath turtles anyway, we just say, I would just say introduction, and or like
you don't even need anything. You just need it to be under the main heading turtles.
Yeah, I think that's what I actually did. Yeah. So
yeah, that's fine. And you know, I mean, there are small things we can change. Like, okay, so reference here, we can just say reference. Then we've got reference. And attributes and methods. And actually, I think those might be at the wrong.
Yeah, it should be H3 and.
But it looks pretty good. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to go back to the presentation now. What I'd like you to do is just keep in mind what we've, not what we've achieved now, but how we did it, okay? That's the important thing for me, because now we're coming on to the really good stuff. Oh, let's go back into slideshow mode and make this full screen. Wonderful. Okay, so we used our compass, and great. So the problem that we looked at in documentation last time was a problem of structure and organization. Today, it's a more personal problem. It's the problem of pain, okay? So documentation is stressful for people, especially when it's not their main job. And I want to make it less stressful and more painless and happier and make you more productive about doing that. But being productive is just a byproduct. I mostly want to take away pain. So think about what's painful in documentation for you. So I can't make anybody's work painless, because sometimes you're going to do something that is a painful thing. If you decide to ride your bicycle up a steep mountain, it's going to be tough. You're going to expect some pain. So I like this photograph. It's me up a mountain, and I look quite slim in that, but my when I dress up like that, my girlfriend says I look like a pregnant salmon, which is so anyway, you know, if you're going to drag your slightly unfit body up a mountain on a bicycle, you know that you're in for some pain, but you expect the pain. You call it good pain. It makes the reward of getting to the top sweeter. It's pain that provides success. If you didn't feel it, that pain, you wouldn't have anything to laugh about when you came back from your holiday. But there's also, so that's necessary pain. There's also unnecessary pain, and that's not good pain. It's the pain of not being sure you're on the right road, or doubting that you're going to make it, or being worried, or worrying that people aren't enjoying themselves, or having to double back because you went the wrong way, or being lost in the dark without lights or food. Okay, that's the kind of pain we want to do without. And there is a lot of that kind of pain in documentation, unnecessary suffering. And it's the suffering of doing things like trying to work out what to do, working out the plan, what topics to tackle, in what order, where things should go, how much to do, where and when to stop, and so on. And it's a kind of anxious feeling that whatever you're doing is too large, that the task is too big, that it won't have value until you've finished doing it, until it's complete, and that you will never get it completed in time, and that by the time you have completed it, it will be already out of date. And that's not success-producing pain, like the pain of pedaling up a mountain. It's the useless frustration of discovering that somebody stole your bicycle while you were at a cafe. You know, that doesn't get you anywhere. And it's a reason that documentation fails to get done. Good documentation fails to get done because it's full of unrewarding pain. And it's all about this devising our complex plans and executing them. And we build these complex monuments about what we want, and then refactoring can be complex. Barry, if it's not urgent, may I continue, or is it very brief and very urgent?
I think it's very brief, and you can address it now or not, but I think there's another aspect which I see very viscerally at work, which is that mountaintop, that success is really poorly defined, because you can and so there's no reward at the end of the journey. Okay,
that mountaintop, that direction, that is Diátaxis. That's what Diátaxis gives us. That tells us why it's good to get to its point. That's our direction. It's pointing at the top of the mountain, and I'll explain more about that. But yes, also we want to feel a little bit of success or pleasure with every little achievement we make. Every time we go over a little hill or round a corner, there should be a kind of benefit. So look, planning, execution, and results. This is a generally uncontroversial and accepted approach to work. Yeah, you plan something, you do it, and you get your results. So you're going to teach a lesson, organize a child's birthday party, you plan, execute, and get a result. I bet that not a single person here has staged a bank robbery without having a plan. Yeah. You would not do it.
The one time I tried, it didn't go so well. So
yeah, you know, and it's the difference between failure and success in all kinds of endeavors, but not in documentation. I think that planning works really badly in documentation. And when you have a plan, when it's a big plan, it's something that's hanging over your head until it's finished. In documentation, it means having unpublished, unpublishable work in progress. And until it's attained some degree of completion, it's actually useless. So now you've got all this hard work to do, and you've added stress on top of your head by having this complex plan. And that's where the pain comes from. So we've got difficult things to do, and now we're worried that we're never going to be able to get them to fruition. So here's a graph that makes it look scientific, okay? That this is our input, our hard work over time, and the value, the usefulness we get from it, okay? So we have to do work, and it's not until we've done quite a bit of work that we get some value from it, when we can publish it. Until then, it's just on our computers, in our heads, or whatever. So each time there's some complex documentation work to be done, we have to go through this long period of difficult labor without any reward. And many complex projects have to be like that. So if you're building a ship, it has to stay in the shipyard until it's ready to be floated. You can't put it in the water until it's ready to float. Otherwise, that will be the end of your ship. And many activities are like that, but not documentation. Documentation doesn't need to be like that. Documentation is about something. It's about something that can have documentation now. So what we have here are these periods of risk. These periods of risk where we're working and not getting result. We're not getting things out of the door. And that's when the product wants its documentation and it doesn't have it. And it's a product in which the product, so it's a period in which the product can change while we're working on the documentation. And that will change, that will upset all our documentation plans. And the more complex the documentation project, the more complex the plans have to be. And the longer that period of uselessness, the more at risk our plans are. And I'm a slow learner, because it has happened to me twice that I toiled away on big documentation plans. And every time I thought I'd got enough work done to be able to propose make a pull request to the project, I found that it had moved on. Too many other pull requests had come in, and there was too much to change, too many merge conflicts and so on, that it failed. And it happened to me once years ago with Django's logging documentation. I put many hours of work into that. And every time I was ready to make a step forward and say, here it is, I was overwhelmed by other things that had changed. You know, doing this part-time as a volunteer in the evenings and so on. And I abandoned it. And as I say, I'm a slow learner. So it also happened to me a second time at one of the EuroPython sprints. I worked on PyTest. I talked to the team and I said, I want to do some restructuring. And it was even worse that time. I did all this work. I went home I did work at the sprint. I went home, and every time over the next few weeks I tried to get this merged, it was impossible. So twice, my ship never even got to leave the shipyard. So it consumed my energy and time, and there was nothing show as a result. And why did that happen? It's because I fell for some software industry propaganda. And I'm not against planning. I think there are plenty of cases like children's parties and bank robberies where I would not do it without planning in minute detail. But in documentation, I think planning can take a back seat, and that we can allow ourselves to be led by concrete, iterative, evolutionary processes. So I'm not against planning. I'm just against the idea that it's always the right process. And I don't see this as a significant difference of opinion or anything like that. I see it as a head-on ideological confrontation with planism. So, you know, down with planism. That's the lesson for today. I see people who suffer in documentation because they believed they needed to plan. I think they're victims of planist propaganda. And I want us to fight planism and planists wherever we find them. I want them to force them back into the territory where they belong. So what does work for me is this principle based on a principle of well-formed growth. So here's a plant, a flowering, I'm no botanist, but does this look like a well-structured plant to you? It does to me. It looks complete. Yeah. How did it arrive at this form? Did it have a plan or an idea of what it was going to become? Well, I don't think it did. I think an organic process took place. It grew through an organic process, and development took place at the cellular level, and the development was guided not by a plan, but by rules that applied to cells. And those rules existed and didn't need to refer to a master plan or a finished picture of a mature form. So in its development from, this is from my high school biology textbook, by the way, in its development from a seed to a mature form, an organism such as a plant is always complete. It's always appropriate to its size and stage of development, and always ready to progress to the next step. So here's a little French bean, and then it's got a root, and the root starts to grow and other things start to happen. And eventually it's a mature organism. And along the way, you will never be tempted to say that something's missing. You will never say, oh, this is an unfinished French bean. It's always complete. It's always a perfect, beautiful little French bean. And it's not finished. That question doesn't even arise. There's always something for it to do next. There's always another step for it to take, something for it to become. So its development is never finished, but the organism is always complete. And of course, yes, it is growing towards a fully developed shape of maturity, but that's not some shape that's known in advance. It's just a direction of growth with an outcome that is not fixed. In fact, that outcome is expected to respond to its conditions and could change at any time. So at any given moment, it's complete but not finished because it's a living, growing, adapting mechanism. And at all times, it's clearly and visibly well formed. Its structure, which changes, is always correct. You never say, oh, it's an incorrect structure. It's always correct. And I think that's a really good metaphor for how we can create new documentation. And we've been doing some restructuring just now in the turtle example. Here's a nice metaphor for large structural changes to existing documentation. The metamorphosis of a tadpole into a frog. It's a continuous process. There's no point in the transformation of the tadpole at which we say, oh, this is a frog in process, a work in progress. You know, it's an incomplete frog. We never say it's in a kind of state of uneasy, freakish transition between one thing and another. It just is what it is at any moment. A tadpole's development is unfinished because there's more for it to do, but it doesn't make it an incomplete frog. It's just a young frog. It's moving in a direction towards maturity. It's enjoying organic development. And at each stage, we can be really happy with it, even though it's not finished. And we can be happy because we don't insist on anything like delivery of the final result. Instead, we trust the process to take us in that direction, and we can be happy with what we have right now as complete and correct, even if it still has more road to go, because we can see what the process is and we accept what it gives us along the way. So the principle is that our documentation can be always complete, but will never be finished. And this gives us pleasure and satisfaction because we know that it's always complete, and it removes anxiety because we never need to worry now about it not being finished. We know it will never be finished. Your own development, your own growth is never going to be finished. It can't be finished. So we can just be relaxed and be happy with it as it is. A reasonable question is, if we don't have a plan, how can we be sure we're not going to create an organic, iteratively evolved mess rather than a nice structure? That's a fair enough question, okay? How do we arrive at a well-formed, because the important thing is not just an organic structure, but a well-formed organic structure? Well, I think it happens because we don't have a plan, because the plant is not working to a blueprint. It doesn't have an idea or a big picture, but it doesn't need one because it has a cellular level arrangement, a cellular level organization and ordering. Its structure comes from within. It builds itself from the inside out, one cell at a time. And the organism experiences healthy growth and good structure when each cell attains a healthy structure, when each cell correctly follows the rules for that particular cell. And our documentation on the large level, or the macro level, will attain a good structure when it develops according to appropriate rules that apply not to the whole thing, but from within, at the level of cells, like words and sentences, as small as possible. And if all the words and the sentences and the paragraphs are right, the sections will become right, and the pages will become right, and the whole will become right, just as it is in organic development. So the principle here is cellular level development guided by rules and not plans. Penil, do you mind if I, do you mind if I hold you until I've just finished this section, and then I'll remind me, okay, in case I forget. I just want to run through a few things. It won't be long. So the unit of work for an organism is its cell. It takes place one cell at a time. What's the smallest thing that we can, what's the smallest step we can take? So each piece of work is small, as it can be, and each one is a step in the right direction, and it represents growth and development. And in an organism, it does it over and over again, this tiny thing over and over and over again. And that's how the whole grows. So same for documentation. Every complete piece of work, every complete piece of action should be as small as the division of a cell. Make it, every piece of work, as simple and completable as possible. That was what I was asking you. What is the smallest thing we can do right now to make an improvement? That's a step in the right direction. Now, have a look at this diagram again, because some of it is smooth and gradual growth. Things get longer and they change from one form into another. But smooth growth also precipitates occasional sudden changes, crises. You know, the skin of the seed becomes not big enough to contain its growth, and so it splits suddenly. At a certain point, the bean bursts out of its shell. The situation became more and more untenable, and then something had to give way, and it did. There was a sudden change in the structure and a new order was established. And this happens all the time in organic growth. You know, a plant's pod bursts open and seeds come out, or a spider or a reptile sheds its skin. You had milk teeth when you were a child. One day you had milk teeth, and then one day you lost a tooth. There was a crisis developed. The situation could no longer hold, and then there was a new order and things settled down for a while. Or, you know, there was a time back some time ago when you were just a tiny little clump of cells, that grew and grew and grew. And one day, there wasn't a pregnant, a woman pregnant with a baby. There were two beings in the world, not quite independent of each other, but there was amazing, ask your parents what an extraordinary new reordering of the world that was, when suddenly there was another being in the world. The situation could no longer be contained because you can't stay in the womb forever. There has to be this crisis. And then we come out of the crisis with a new order. And we should welcome this in documentation. It happens especially when we're improving existing documentation. What I'm saying is we should be glad when we see crises developing in documentation, when we see an untenable situation developing. So let's say you have a tutorial, and let's say that you notice that there's reference and other explanation mixed up in it. And the more you develop and improve the tutorial, the worse this other stuff looks, because it really looks starting to look out of place now. You made the tutorial really clearly a tutorial, and this other stuff is sticking out like a sore thumb. Well, that's great. That means at least you've got some clarity that it's standing out against. It's got a strong form that makes it possible for the problem to show. So the temptation is to blend these ill-fitting things together, to make them coexist by blurring their edges. Well, don't do that. Help the crisis develop, and allow the tutorial material to become more robustly a tutorial. If you've got explanation stuff in the middle, don't try and hide it. Give it a big title, explanation, and leave it sticking out right in the middle of the tutorial, so that every time you go past it, you see what it is. Highlight it, move all the explanation stuff together, so now you've got a big chunk of it. And be comfortable with that. It's a crisis in development, but those are natural processes and they're good, because at some point, all this explanation stuff in the tutorial will be standing out so much and so badly, you'll think, okay, today's the day where I snip it out and put it where it really belongs. And you will have established a new order. But you could only do that by allowing this crisis to develop. Otherwise, you'd have maybe bits of explanation scattered around in the tutorial, which you'd kind of half made blend in with it in an unsatisfactory way. So you need to encourage the development of crisis, because that gives you robust things that you can safely transplant. So don't avoid crisis, let it build up, let it become really obvious until it's no longer bearable. And then you have a simple operation that you can do that will establish a new and better order with this act of reorganization. So these are our principles for organic, well-formed growth, that our documentation should aspire to be always complete but never finished. It has a direction, but we don't know its end. We can guarantee good structure without plans. We want cellular development guided by rules that takes place from the inside and works outwards. It improves one tiny little cell at a time. We accept crisis as part of healthy development, and we only try to restructure when the moment is right for it. Okay. Questions? I know some, or thoughts. I'll let you gather your thoughts, but somebody's already got a question, so fire away.
Sort of building on top of this concept of organic growth, it seems like maybe one of the things that's really valuable is feedback, and sort of building feedback loops. Because thinking of it in terms of a plant growing, a plant will grow towards light, and in the same way, like figuring out what your users want or need is like an important part of building the right how-tos, instead of just the how-tos that you can think of, or building the right tutorials instead of just the ones you can think of. Like, it's a little bit outside the process of what actually goes down on paper, but do you have a sense of sort of like approaches that you like for building those feedback loops?
Well, they have to exist as a first thing, and they often don't. In open source documentation, we often have very good ones because the community are all talking about things. And, think about the organism developing. It's embedded in the feedback loops of its environment. It will change the way it grows according to the stuff that's happening around it, as well as the material that it's referring to. So it can respond because at any given moment, it's only one tiny little thing that has to respond. We don't restructure the whole documentation in response to somebody's question. We just, okay, what's the one thing that I can do right now that's going to make this better? So
if you don't mind me like just chiming in here, because this is really for me at work, this is really a critical piece of the puzzle, right? Because imagine you have an engineering manager who's managing a team, and we have, 1,000 of them, right, all over the place. And they're thinking about, well, I have limited resources, so how do I incentivize my team to write documentation, because they don't see the value of it. This is something I was getting to earlier. And I think data and feedback and engagement and having a level of engagement. So what I mean by that is you see a typo or a problem in a documentation, it's great if you could just open up a little side panel and say, I didn't understand how to get from paragraph 2 to paragraph 3. Boom, you're done, right? More engaged might be, I can open a bug report and actually explain what's going on in a bug report that gets tracked. Even more engaged might be, hey, I can fix this because I know how to improve the docs, and I'll just create a PR, right? And so there's a feedback loop that absolutely has to be engaged, because now we have to, convince managers and executives that this is a valuable thing to invest in, knowing it's never going to be finished.
Yeah. So I think the one thing to do is to give people not tasks, but time. Say, okay, you're going to spend 1 hour every day working on documentation. So now I don't care what you do, actually. I just want you to work on documentation. The second thing is, think about bicycling up that mountain. Every single pedal stroke gets you a little bit higher. However painful, after each pedal stroke, as long as you made that pedal stroke, you're a little bit further along the road. And that is progress. And we see that progress with every piece of effort that we make. And that's how it should be in our documentation. Every single effort, you know that graph I showed, we want to avoid that period where there is effort going in and we're not making progress, because for people to see their own progress is the most valuable thing. And that's why every piece of work should be as tiny as possible. So if my task is to fix Django's logging documentation, I will spend hours and hours and hours and nobody will see it. But if I change one heading, I will feel that much better at the end of the day. And tomorrow I will do another heading.
Yeah, I totally agree. What I think there's a motivation from the engineer who is the subject matter expert, but I think there's another piece to that, and that's what's closing the loop, which is the customers or the users who are consuming that documentation. We need to get feedback from them, both objective data, right? Like, page views and page hovers and things like that, but also subjective feedback. That's really critical.
I mean, I think that's slightly out of the scope of this, but I do agree that feedback and constant feedback and the kind of feedback you just get from seeing something change, seeing your name in a pull in a commit, wherever you find feedback, make use of it, because this work without result is a stake through the heart of documentation progress. And that's what we want to avoid. I'm going to move on a little bit. Oh, by the way, so no, I'll move on a bit and then we'll talk. So look, this is the workflow that I want to share with you. This is what I've learned. Now, imagine children, fantastic for examples, because they're such a nuisance, they make such a difference to they take over everything. So have you ever cleaned up a child's bedroom after an extremely messy party with toys scattered one piece of Lego deep across the entire surface. Yeah. If you go in there and think, okay, I'm going to have to tidy up this apocalypse of a mess, and you think, right, I know that in here somewhere there's a little minibus with 6 people in it. There's a toy aeroplane with a pilot and passengers, and there's a little boat with some people, and somewhere there's a little toy dog that goes amongst these things. If you start, okay, here's the bus, and then go looking for the people in the bus, and eventually you might find the 6 people, but it will take you hours because they're all buried underneath something. And then you've got to do the whole thing again for the aeroplane and the boat. No, you quickly learn that that's not possible. What you do is you pick something up. You pick up the first thing that you see at your feet, and it's a person. You say, oh, hang on, yeah, I know this person. This person goes with those other people, and I think they live in the boat. So you just put it on the side where, okay, there's one thing that you've put, not in its final destination, but at least you've pulled it out of the mess. And you put it on the windowsill, and now you're by the windowsill and you see something else. You say, oh, here's the dog that goes in the bus. You put that there. And then you suddenly realize, oh, and there's the actual bus. So now you can put the 2 things together. And you go on a random walk around the room every time you pick something up. And after a while you think, oh, hang on, there are all the people now. All the people are in the bus. Great, I've established a little bit of order here. It just kind of emerged from my random walk, picking up those pieces. And the random walk means that you encounter things that you wouldn't otherwise have noticed. You think, oh, this person goes with that person over there. And on the way that you're walking over there, you think, oh, and there's the, I don't know, the motorbike that goes to the bus that was lying next to it. And you keep on doing this. And bit by bit, you are establishing order. Not because you had a finished picture of what the room looks like, but because you followed these rules at the cellular level, one thing at a time. So you pick something up, you think, what is this thing? Is it in the right place? No, it's not. What's the one thing I'm going to do with right now with this thing that will make the world better? Oh, I'll put it there on the windowsill. And you put it there. And you do that, and then you pick the next thing up at your feet, and you go round that loop again and again and again. And the considering you do is the Diátaxis considering, what user need is represented by this. How well does it serve that need? What could be added or moved or changed to make it better? One small, what can I do to do that? One tiny thing. And then you do it, and you go round again and again and again and again. And the structure, the quality will emerge from that process. That's how the order develops out of these cellular actions. And this works just as well for new development from the start, or for refactoring. For new development, it means everything we do, every single action produces value. We get this modest effort, and it produces meaningful output. And all growth is always in the right direction. Or if it's refactoring, then it works from the inside out, transforming this stuff in place. And we don't try and make big changes of order, except when we've got robust material that can easily be transplanted from here to there. And, if you try and refactor documentation, especially if it's something like a tutorial or a how-to guide, you are very likely to break its logic. You will make one little change and you won't notice it. The first person to notice it will be the user who tries to do your tutorial and fails, because if you botch your refactoring of code, then at least you've got automated tests and they will have the decency to fail. But you don't have that for documentation. And this approach, whether it's for refactoring or new development, it just keeps the work flowing organically. And I love this because it means I can have really tiny ambitions and be happy about achieving them 10 times in a day. The smallest things. I'm not tackling grand plans. I'm not thinking in terms of solving problems. I'm just looking at one thing that's in front of me, considering how good it is, and if it can be improved, what can I do to improve it? And then I do it, and then the next thing. Ned.
So this is a topic that's come up in Discord threads, maybe discourse threads, I forget which of the two. So you're talking about guided by rules, but we may have multiple people working with different ideas of rules in their heads. And to go back to your example, my son believed that Legos should be sorted by color, which is obviously wrong. They should be sorted by shape. So if he and I were both working on cleaning up the room, we would be working against each other.
You need the right rules. But if you have Diátaxis, you have a little truth table of all those are the only rules you need. And if we're all sharing the same set of rules and we're only doing tiny things, we can all work on the room together without getting in each other's way. Because if we're trying to do big projects, my project might, the things that I'm doing might intersect with the things that you're doing, and it becomes really difficult to merge them together. But if we're only moving one tiny little thing at a time, every time I've taken a step, you won't be committing huge chunks of work that throw all my own plans out of, knock my plans out of the road. You'll have done a little thing and I can easily adjust to it. And with, let's assume we're using the rules of Diátaxis, using that compass, then we can have 10 people doing it and they will all be thinking in the same way. And, of course, sometimes little things will go wrong, but that's what talking is for. And then we only have to talk about small things instead of how do we merge these two enormous things.
Right. Small steps is good. Incremental improvement.
Yeah.
And tight feedback loops.
Tight feedback loops, always tight loops. Simon? I don't hear you, Simon.
A trick I've been using is every time someone asks me a question that can be answered by my documentation, I send them a link to that piece of documentation, and then I read it, and then I make little improvements to it, because it's just a way of, so reading your docs after 6 months is such a great way of going, oh, wow, that could be clearer. And it's using that as a trigger, somebody asking you a question and answering it. It's just a nice way to randomly drop into little pieces of documentation and improve them.
It's like the random walk. The encounter, the fresh encounter with something, and then you think, oh, I saw that 5 minutes ago. I know what this goes with. Yes, and it's really important, because if you have the big picture, you try to do it from the top down, you will have these prejudices, blind spots. You'll be guaranteed to miss things. The random walk takes you into the corners and makes you see under the bed, and where the things had rolled, where you didn't realize, where you hadn't expected them to roll.
What I also try to do to maybe close that feedback loop a little bit is when someone asks a question or opens an issue where I feel like this should be obvious from the documentation. And of course, there is a chance that person just didn't bother reading it. But I always try to ask nicely, is there something we could do in the documentation to explain this better? Because maybe it's just not explained well, or there's room for misunderstanding somewhere, and then that's a very good points to get an outsider's perspective by just asking them.
No. So, I really like this. I don't have to think in terms of priorities. I don't have to have plans that might fail or whatever. I don't have plans. When I have half an hour, 10 minutes, an hour, I look at it and I do something and I achieve something, and the world is that much better. And all I need is the time, and it's the time that's nothing else. No, it's not my ability to execute complex feats of documentation re-engineering. It's just the amount of time. As long as I keep pedaling up that mountain and I know the direction, which I do because I've got the map and the compass, I will get to the top. It might be tough, but I just have to do one pedal stroke after another, and we will all get to the top. So I don't have to worry. I know the documentation is full of problems. I know that it's never going to be finished. And I know that there are going to be these crises developing. But I'm relaxed about that. I expect that. I'm relieved from the stress of having, of writing documentation that I'm responsible for, that isn't finished, and it will not have value until it is finished. And that stress is taken away from me. The only thing I need to think about is what I have in my hand. So I've gone from difficult thinking to easy doing, and I've agreed with myself, I've made a contract with myself that the work will never be finished. No problem, I don't mind now. But every single action will be a small step in the direction of growth and development. And I don't have to take responsibility for anything more burdensome than the improvement of one cell at a time. So here's more science. Here's a graph showing the usefulness of work driven by planning versus the work driven by a principle of well-formed organic growth. So we just start getting that value immediately, consistently, and more overall, with less anxiety, because there's no grand plan to be upset, just this continuous series of responsive little improvements. And I had a really nice experience watching the folks working on SQLite documentation. I wanted to mention that because I was really, you know, all of you were approaching it with such seriousness, and you were doing, I could, you know, see you thinking through all those Diátaxis questions and working them out and thinking about those things. And when we were talking about it, I can't remember who was saying it in the GitHub thread. Well, you know, we should have planned this better, and so on. And I was thinking, okay, well, we'll talk about this on Thursday. No, you didn't need to plan anything. Every time you made one of those tiny little improvements, I would have made the pull request for a sentence, a heading, a word, and got someone else to approve it and merge it. And the documentation would have been one little bit better. And don't try and you're trying to, it was great, you know, you really have done fantastic work on it. But we're not disagreeing about the destination, just about how you pedaled up that mountain. I think that you could have made your life easier by just doing it one tiny thing at a time and agreeing with each other that however small and banal the pull requests were, somebody would quickly get to them and accept them. And you could all, a lot of your work was coordinating different people's actions and directions so that you didn't trample on each other's feet. That quite rightly. But if you were only doing things one sentence at a time and you were following the same rules and agreed how they work, you wouldn't need to coordinate because the rules would do the coordination for you.
The problem is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I asked, I think I said that on one of my comments on the GitHub thread was, if you would reflect on how you felt about that process, what the experience was like, and to bring it to the group. So if anyone wants to say something about that, I'd really be interested to hear that. But yeah, go on. Let's have some of your thoughts about that.
One of the problems with the really small changes, especially in a GitHub pull environment, is the overhead of having to go through the pull. You've now taken up 30 seconds to a minute just navigating the UI to get a one-sentence improvement. And the batching, if you will, of changes basically amortizes the cost of moving it through the process over a larger series. And I've had PRs sit out there for literally weeks and had people change around it that never got merged. So how do you stop that? First, the cost of actually doing the merge operation, and second, actually make sure that things get merged in the proper order. So I've done a change to something, and then somebody else did a change to the same thing, and we still stepped on each other.
Well, sometimes that will happen. I mean, you can't, it's impossible to eliminate it. I mean, but never mind, it's going to happen sometimes. But if you're going to step on each other over one sentence or one heading, not over two huge sections that you're both trying to do different complex restructuring operations on. And yes, there is a little bit of overhead, but if you're agreed, if you've got a contract with yourselves and with others that these are going to be tiny little changes, as long as each little change is obeying those simple rules, the overhead is tiny and the end result actually is less work. The most, you know, those things that get stuck are often when somebody has to judge something, has to build up this big context of what's being proposed in order to make a judgment about it. Whereas if you can make those judgments really tiny for the reviewer, then they've got 5 minutes now before the next meeting. Oh, if only there was some really low-hanging fruit that I could quickly approve in GitHub. That's how work can get done quickly, and the satisfaction is mutual. I approved something. It was obvious that it wasn't very big. It looked banal, but fine. It was one tiny little step in the right direction. I promise it does work. I see more hands up. So, anyone?
This is Jim. I'll jump in. One of the problems with small granular changes is it adds inconsistency to something that's consistent. So like we've got a tutorial, it uses one term for a concept, and I think, okay, my granular change is that term is wrong, we should use a different term. If I make a change in one place, now I've made the tutorial use inconsistent terminology. If I try and do the change throughout the tutorial, that may make it a larger change, which makes it too hard for me, or it gets into a larger debate about whether it's the right change.
And you might have to have that debate. So you might have to say, let's decide to call these things nodes or instances. We agree on it, and we remember that. We've had a conversation, and then, okay, then we'll see that these little steps take us on the random walk, don't forget. So we keep encountering things that are not just the thing that we've been fixated on for the last 2 weeks. We see the little pieces of the bigger picture. So we are having these encounters with each other and the stuff that allow us to consider this. I saw this going on in the SQLite, really careful considering of this. But are you going to hold things up while you make a decision about the name? No. If you can make an improvement now, make the improvement, and then the next improvement can be to fix that inconsistency. That's fine. Nobody's going to. It's not the end of the world if things are a little bit inconsistent. Maybe you have to build up to this crisis that needs to be resolved. It's fine. But the little steps the momentum will keep you going forward. Barry or Erland?
Yeah, I mentioned this in the chat, and I was just gonna talk about it here because this sense of authorship friction, right? Creating a pull request. This is exactly why people want to use Google Docs and wikis, because they think all I have to do is just like, I can click one button, type a bunch of stuff, boom, commit, no review, no delay, nothing, right? But in the long run, it leads to just unusable documentation. Either like in Google Docs, unsearchable, unfindable, or in the wiki, just no quality control whatsoever. So it's definitely a tension, for authors, to try to bring that friction down while still retaining a bit of quality control and findability, right? Yeah. It's a tension I all the time. Yeah.
So I never said this is going to make you're still going to have to drag your carcass up that mountain. That's the one thing I can't flatten the mountain for you.
Right.
There is work to be done, and there is thinking work and talking work and so on. But we can get rid of the unnecessary work, the stress-inducing work.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a moment, but Erland, you have your hand raised as well. I'm not hearing
You're
you.
muted.
I think we can hear you, Erland. You're muted.
Yes, you asked about the SQLite pull request, about the tutorial, which have not yet landed yet. So until now, I've been doing work on the reference, which I've been doing in very small steps, and it has been very successful, I'd say. Then I did try for some large refactorings, which I had to put on hold because, as you say, it's better to pick something up, look at it. What can I do with this? Yes, I can fix this. Commit it. So with the tutorial, I had a plan of like doing it incrementally, and we ended up rewriting it completely. Probably not the best way, but it was a great learning experience, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the thing that really impressed me about the discussion that I saw about that SQLite tutorial, by the way, was the reflection on the process itself. This is what I'm interested in, is the process. And there was clearly a lot of learning going on about the experience, and people making the point that, oh, well, you know, this is an example of how one only really learns a skill by doing it. You know, this, okay, there's a Diátaxis framework, now we're learning it, right? Now we're doing it. That's not in the workshop when we were talking or listening. Of course, you didn't learn anything through listening, or you learned it by doing stuff. And that's when it became real. You had the real bodily experience of doing it.
Yeah, just one comment there. So all three of us had been reading and discussing Diátaxis a lot before we started this rewrite. And I, for my part, was pretty confident that, you know, I know everything about the Diátaxis tutorial. This is going to be fairly easy. And I was completely wrong. And there was a lot of details that I just, probably overlooked when reading through the Diátaxis framework. Or maybe I just forgot them while doing stuff because I didn't have it in my hands. It wasn't in my muscle memory.
No. So I mentioned twice Django's logging documentation, PyTest documentation, failed restructuring experiences from 5 years ago or so. Last year, I was between jobs. I thought, okay, let's do this again. But this time, I wrote to the PyTest team. I said, look, I want to do this again, but this time I'm going to do it in a different way. And all I need from you is a commitment that you will review my tiny little pull requests really quickly, and that you'll accept them, even if they look really banal, if I just change a word in a heading. And, you know, they'd already agreed that which mountain we wanted to climb the top of. I was just now proposing a different way of getting to the top of that mountain. They said, yeah. And that's what we did. And that's how it got refactored, restructured this time. Sometimes I made a pull request where I changed a word in a heading. After a while, I moved stuff around and I found a big block. Oh, this is great. This can be moved somewhere else. And it worked this time. This is why it now has the Diátaxis structure. And it's not finished. It never will be finished. In fact, you know, if I had time, I could jump in and do some more of it. I would like to. I don't have the time. But it's definitely better than it was before. And even if I'd been interrupted halfway through, it wouldn't have been left in a freaky, unsatisfactory state, because everything I touched got better as a result. And the whole was also starting to get better. And then, you know, these crises appeared and we were able to do things. I did the same with Django, with the logging documentation. I spoke to Mariusz and Carlton, the Django fellows, and said, look, I want to do this again. And before there was one big Django logging topic. Now there's a logging explanation topic and a logging reference and a logging how-to. And we did it in exactly the same way, just tiny little pull requests. Sometimes they took me 5 minutes. They must have taken literally seconds for somebody to review. So, you know, this obviously looks like an improvement. Yes, thank you very much. And if I'd stopped at any time, it wouldn't have mattered. If someone else jumped in with the same principles, we wouldn't have been treading on each other's feet, because I didn't have a grand plan. I knew where the top of the mountain was. I had the map and the compass, and that's all I needed. And I promise you, it will work for complex restructuring projects. You can try it. And I can also work with new projects. This is an example of something starting from scratch. So I like to over there, I've got a cupboard full of 35mm cameras that I like to fool around with. So they've got fantastic mechanisms. I love to take them apart and repair them. They've got a lot of logic encoded in these mechanisms. And some years ago, I modeled one of the cameras I'd been repairing in a few lines of object-oriented Python code, just for fun. And I thought, okay, let's do something with this. This was some of that file. So I tidied it around, up a bit. And I thought, okay, I'm going to publish this. Because it had just been sitting on my computer. So I added a README file. And that's all it was, a 35mm camera simulated in Python, based on the Canonet G3 QL17, so little rangefinder. And I committed that, and my documentation was complete. It was like the tiny little French bean seed, okay? It was not finished, but at that moment, at that stage, it was complete. I went to bed happy, I hadn't committed any crimes against documentation. Now, if I were tempted by the propaganda of the planists, I would start making plans and writing out sections, empty sections for me to complete. And that would be a really bad move. I would just be giving myself stress, reminding, it's not, they wouldn't remind me of anything I didn't know anyway. They would just give me anguish by representing visibly lacking incomplete work. So of course I did not do that. I just asked, what can I do right now at this instant that would be an appropriate single step along the path for development and growth of this documentation? So I wrote a few lines on how to get started, like a proto tutorial. In fact, Simon, did you have your hand up?
So 3 years ago, I set myself a policy that a feature was not landed. It didn't count until it was covered in the documentation. And it has had completely revolution. All of my projects are fully documented now, because you start with, this README with a couple of sentences and the first feature that you built described in, and that takes very little time because it's only like 2 or 3 paragraphs in the code example. And then the next time you add a feature, you add a few more lines in the code example. And it means that your stuff is fully documented. Now, it doesn't give you tutorials and it doesn't give you how-tos. So those are the things which I'm beginning to focus on now, because you can't really incrementally build a tutorial. That is something which I feel, or if you can, I'd love to know how to do that.
Well, you can. I mean, so this was a few lines in the tutorial, and it wasn't finished. It only got that far. A 2-year-old baby is not finished. A 2-year-old child is not finished, but it's complete. It doesn't know algebra, and it can't play tennis, and it can't do the washing up. So it's
okay.
It's not ready.
Sold. I'm going to try incrementally building a tutorial for my next piece of software. Because the other thing that happens is eventually my README is like 15 scrolls of the browser wide, and then I'll fire up Read the Docs and Sphinx and migrate my projects into a full documentation site. But often I can hold off quite a long time before I do that. And the refactoring into that separate site isn't actually that challenging these days.
If it got this far, just as creating an instance and invoking a method of it, well, okay, I know it's not finished, but I knew that it wasn't going to be finished, so it doesn't bother me. Up until that point, that's complete. It's well formed. That's the important thing. It's well formed. It looks and smells like a tutorial already. There's nothing wrong about that.
Okay.
And then I wrote some more stuff. I added some components in the camera models. Okay, that's kind of like reference, isn't it? If you're talking about the components of the machine. And then I thought, okay, well, why? I felt like writing, saying, why the hell am I doing this? Why? That's actually explanation, isn't it? Why? But I don't call it explanation. Just have a line there. Why? I just know that that's the form in which I was writing. And I was also developing the code because I got quite into it, and I added some material about exceptions. And so I had components and exceptions, and I decided, okay, those can now go underneath a reference heading. So now the structure is starting to emerge out of these low-level cellular actions. And I added some tests because I'm a good person, and I thought, okay, how to run tests. There we are. We know what that is. Look, it's 2 lines. Install PyTest and run PyTest. That's literally all there is to it. And then I expanded the explanation stuff about, and that became a new main section. And then something happened. It felt too big to be contained in a single README file. It reached the point where it burst out of its shell like the French bean. And so it became different sections in a Sphinx documentation set. And I didn't plan for that. It just felt right at that moment. It felt like the obvious and easy thing to do. And I published it on Read the Docs, and I've continued to develop it. You know, you can do stuff like that. You can, if you open the back of the camera before rewinding the film, then you will ruin the film in this simulation of the camera. So it's, you know, it's a working little camera, and it's reasonably mature. You can make and run the documentation, and it went on Hacker News and people liked it, and so on. And at no time was there any stress in this. It felt like growing a little bean into a plant. I had to nurture it. I had to think about it. I had to spend time on it. I had to do the work, but I didn't have any time this feeling of something incompleted hanging over my head. And I published it early and often. And I was happy to have immature, unfinished documentation, because some organisms are immature and unfinished. That's how they're born. They just need to grow. But it was always right for its stage of growth. And every single thing I did was a tiny little step of growth. It added to its usefulness. It was all growth in the right direction. So that is my message. And I think possibly this is a more significant contribution to documentation practice than Diátaxis itself. Because this is the part that really gives people a hard time. This process where their effort doesn't produce results, where the stress, the pain is not the necessary pain, but the unnecessary pain. And I use it in tiny little projects, single projects. I'm introducing it as a way of working across Canonical's documentation internally at the company. I've used it with PyTest and Django. I know others who are using it, and my colleagues are teaching other teams to use it within Canonical. And I think that this, let's call it a revolution, because we want to overthrow the planists. We want to overthrow their propaganda. I want them to tremble in their beds when they hear my name. That would make me happy. If we can take the planning out of documentation, I think it will go much faster. We need to be prepared. We need to have our bicycles in good order to go up that mountain. We need to get up early in the morning to do it. We need to make sure that we're reasonably fit and healthy and so on. We need to look after the slower members of the party, and we need to know the direction. We need to have the map and the compass, but we don't need to plan all those steps along the way. We just get on the bikes, start pedaling, and the pedaling actually gets easier as you go along, because you're doing it. You're becoming your muscles, your muscle memory, your brain memory, your brain muscles, sorry, they're becoming better at doing this stuff. Just like if you pedal up lots of mountains, you go up them faster after a while, even if you look like a pregnant salmon while you're doing it. Thank you very much, everyone. And Maria, this up. I've really enjoyed it. It's been nice hearing your experiences and comments. I've sent the link there for some feedback. If you can provide some, that's really great. You know, if you can, any comments, you know, if you want to give me any nice words I can put on the website or my t-shirt or my gravestone, then that's always welcome as well. And I'll see you around, and I hope to hear about your successful adventures in documentation and riding up mountains. Like the planists. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everybody.